In the cold, desolate plains of Wyoming, 1882, something occurred that no one living, or dead, would dare to write in the official records. A boy, no taller than most men's knees, vanished under the moonlight of a silent prairie town. By dawn, he was not just grown. He had become a titan, standing 9 feet tall, a figure of impossible strength and terrifying presence. People whispered that the earth itself had recoiled when he drew his first breath as a man overnight. But what the historians deliberately ignored, the townsfolk never forgot. They felt it in their bones. Some forces are older than humanity, and when awakened, they bow to nothing, not laws, not men, not God. The story begins not with the boy, but with the shadow that followed him, a shadow that watched, always, in the corners of empty barns, in the black silhouettes of gnarled trees, in the edges of candlelight. Something had chosen him, something older than time, something that saw potential in raw human flesh and unshaped will. And that something was patient, patient enough to wait until the exact moment his life would crack open, and he would step into a power no man could comprehend. You think you know growth. You think you understand age and strength. But the boy, and what he became, shattered every law you hold sacred. No one taught him, no priest, no teacher, no mentor. He learned the world in ways that terrified the adults around him. A whisper of a thought, a flicker in a barn, and animals would obey, and men would stumble as if the earth itself rejected their steps. The town tried to rationalize, tried to hide it behind superstition and rumor. But this boy, now a colossal force of nature, was a living warning. Knowledge and power, when willed by forces unseen, does not wait for time. The first night he appeared as Big Jakab, people saw their reflection in terror and awe, a mirror of suppressed truths they had buried under generations of obedience. And that, right there, is the first rule you must understand. The world you see is only a fraction of reality. There are currents beneath every law, every story, every history book designed to make you compliant. And the boy, they called him Big Jakab, was the first crack in that system, the living proof that what they tell you is safe, is only a cage. By the time the sun rose fully over the Wyoming plains, the townsfolk were paralyzed with disbelief. Doors remained locked, windows shuttered, and whispers carried across empty streets like the wind itself was warning them. Big Jakab, once a boy, now a force beyond comprehension, walked among them, each step bending the earth slightly, each breath a reminder that the laws of nature had been rewritten overnight. They tried to rationalize, tried to convince themselves this was some freak of nature, a circus act come to life. But deep inside, they knew the truth. Something unnatural, something deliberate had taken root. The adults avoided him, but the children could not. They were drawn to him, instinctively sensing power they could not yet articulate. And this is where you need to pay attention. Power, especially forbidden power, has a language. It speaks in instinct, in fear, in awe, and in the quiet recognition of the unexplainable. Big Jakab understood this language. He learned it before he could speak, before he could reason. And in that understanding, he became more than human. He became a mirror, showing each person what they had buried deep in themselves. The longing to break free from limitations, the terror of what would happen if they did. By nightfall, the town's whispers turned into stories, stories that would never appear in print, stories that would haunt the edges of memory for decades. Some claimed they saw him lift a horse with one hand. Others swore the rivers changed course when he passed by. But the truth is stranger than the legends. Big Jakab was not simply growing in size. He was growing in influence, in presence, in the ability to bend perception itself. And this is the crucial point few dare to acknowledge. True power never announces itself in whispers. It seeps in, it reshapes reality, it rewrites history before your eyes. And by the time you notice, the world you knew no longer exists. The adults made mistakes. They called for lawmen, for priests, for scientists, but all failed. Each intervention only confirmed what the boy, no, the force, already knew. Fear is a tool, obedience a trap. And here's the first lesson Big Jakab silently taught them. Institutions, traditions, authority. These are the chains men wear willingly. Break the chain, and they have no defense. They cannot reason with what they cannot understand, and nothing in their carefully structured world prepared them for a boy who had grown beyond their comprehension in the span of a single night. What no one realized that night, what the town never understood, was that Big Jakab's growth was not a random miracle. It was a deliberate awakening. Somewhere, in the shadows beyond sight, forces older than nations had chosen him. They had been watching, shaping, whispering through the currents of history, waiting for the right vessel. And that vessel was him. The boy they thought they knew was only a mask, a placeholder until the moment of transformation. Behind his sudden height and strength lay a knowledge, a guidance invisible to everyone else, instructing him how to move, how to think, how to manipulate the world with subtle gestures that terrified the untrained mind. This is where most men falter, where the naive believe that power is measured in muscle or in loud proclamations. Real power, the kind that changes reality, is psychological. It penetrates fear, reshapes loyalty, and bends perception to its will. Big Jakab understood this instinctively. He did not need to speak to command. He did not need to fight to dominate. Every glance, every gesture, every heartbeat he imposed on the people around him was a lesson in obedience and awareness. And here, for the first time, you begin to see the frightening truth. Human history is a stage, and those who understand the hidden scripts, the unseen manipulations, the silent currents of control, can move men like pieces on a board. By the third night, the town itself began to fracture. Neighbors no longer trusted neighbors. Friends whispered in fear, and even the bravest souls felt their reason slipping. There were reports, carefully suppressed, of animals acting strangely, doors opening without touch, fires behaving as though guided by an unseen hand. Big Jakab had become more than a boy. He was a signal, a warning, a living embodiment of the hidden forces that pull at the foundations of society, unseen and unchallenged. The people of Wyoming did not understand it, but you, listening now, must. There is a system operating behind the curtain of civilization, older than governments, older than law. And when someone steps into alignment with it, whether by choice or design, they change the game entirely. Remember this, the world you inhabit is carefully curated, each story, each tradition, each historical record designed to keep you compliant. Big Jakab's existence ripped open the veil, exposing the uncomfortable reality. Not all power is meant to be known, not all transformations are permitted, and some knowledge is considered too dangerous to survive contact with the ordinary mind. By recognizing it, you already step closer to it. But beware, the deeper you go, the less you can unsee, the less safe your mind becomes in the world you thought you controlled. The origin of Big Jakab's sudden transformation was not the work of chance. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon of Wyoming, hidden in the folds of secret societies, ancient orders, and elite circles, there existed knowledge deliberately withheld from ordinary men. Knowledge that dictated who could rise, who could fall, and who would become untouchable. Big Jakab had been chosen, guided by invisible hands that understood the mechanics of human evolution, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, and psychologically. His growth was not merely bodily. It was the awakening of latent capabilities that centuries of manipulation had quietly seeded in the human line. You need to understand this, because it matters more than any story you've ever been told. Humans are not as autonomous as they think. Institutions, traditions, even religion itself, has always functioned as a filter, a control system, a method to ensure that only the approved paths of thought and action are followed. Big Jakab bypassed these systems. The people who monitored him, the unseen architects of his rise, had prepared him to ignore rules that enslave ordinary men. And once he did, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. Laws meant to bind him, priests meant to guide him, elders meant to contain him. All failed. Every structure erected to maintain order crumbled before a single force that understood the hidden mechanics of reality. This is why men fear the unknown, why history repeats itself with the same patterns of oppression and obedience. Fear is not random, it is programmed. Obedience is cultivated. And when someone like Big Jakab emerges, someone whose mind, body, and presence align with the hidden laws of influence, the established order cannot survive. People see power and they panic. They see knowledge and they tremble. And yet, for every man who trembles, there is another who glimpses the forbidden and feels a hunger, a pull, a recognition that the world is far bigger, far darker, and far more malleable than he ever realized. By the fourth night, Big Jakab had learned something crucial about the people who observed him. Fear can be weaponized, loyalty can be manufactured, and perception itself can be altered without a single word. He did not need to threaten, he simply existed, and the world rearranged itself around him. And now, you must grasp this too. What he did is a lesson, a blueprint, and a warning. The forces guiding him still exist today, quietly selecting, quietly preparing, quietly awakening those who are willing to see beyond the veil. Those who do not are consumed by routine, tradition, and the carefully constructed illusion of safety. By the fifth night, the town itself had begun to change, not in obvious ways, but in ways that could be felt in the bones. Streets that had once been lively were now quiet, as if the very air had grown heavy with anticipation. People walked faster, spoke in hushed tones, and avoided looking directly at the colossal figure who had once been a boy. Big Jakab's presence was no longer an event, it was an environment. The entire town bent subconsciously around him, obeying rules they could not articulate, constrained by fear they did not fully understand. And this is the first truth you must absorb. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Often, it manifests as invisible gravity, pulling the world into alignment with its will. You see, humans are conditioned to respond to perception more than reality. Big Jakab's growth was more than physical. His mind had already mastered the subtle art of psychological dominance. He could move through a room and alter the behavior of every person inside without a single word. A raised eyebrow, a glance, a pause in motion, these were enough to create obedience, hesitation, loyalty, or terror. Every instinct that humans consider natural had been hijacked, not by magic, not by miracles, but by an understanding of hidden systems, patterns of control buried in plain sight across history, society, and education. He had become the embodiment of a principle older than any institution. Those who understand the unseen rules write reality itself. By now, some of the townsfolk had begun to whisper among themselves, but even these murmurs were shaped by fear. They were afraid to speak clearly, afraid to challenge, afraid to even think too deeply. Their minds were no longer their own. They were tributaries feeding into a river that Big Jakab controlled by mere existence. He had become a living experiment in human manipulation, a proof that perception can dominate action, that reality can be bent before your eyes when someone has learned the laws that remain hidden to the masses. And this is the second truth you must grasp. The world you perceive, the world you inhabit, is not neutral. It is curated, designed, and manipulated by forces that hide behind shadows, traditions, and silent agreements. This is where men either awaken or remain trapped. Observe closely, because the next step is crucial. Big Jakab did not just influence individuals. He reshaped systems. A town is a system. A society is a system. And once someone understands the hidden levers within that system, once someone like Big Jakab exists, the old rules crumble. Fear is weaponized, loyalty is extracted without coercion, and obedience becomes a natural response. What you are seeing in his story is a blueprint of control, a secret they have tried to hide from men for centuries, because knowledge of it gives power unimaginable. By the sixth night, it became clear that Big Jakab's transformation was not random. There was a rhythm, a pattern to his growth, and an invisible guidance shaping every action. Those who watched from the shadows, the architects of his awakening, were not idle. They understood something most men never see. The world is governed by hidden currents, by laws older than empires, and by forces that reward precision, patience, and audacity. Big Jakab was the culmination of centuries of preparation, a living testament to the fact that true power is never accidental. It is designed, honed, and delivered at exactly the right moment. The town had begun to fracture along invisible lines. Families whispered accusations in corners, neighbors avoided eye contact, and even children, who instinctively sensed power, hesitated to approach. Big Jakab walked among them as though he were a force of nature, yet each movement was deliberate, calculated. He had learned to read fear, desire, and obedience as if they were written across the human face in a language only he could understand. And in that, he became more than a boy who grew overnight. He became an agent of psychological authority, a master of perception, a mirror of the hidden systems that guide humanity without its consent. What is most disturbing, and what the historians never recorded, is the way he began to shape not just behavior, but thought. People began to doubt their own memories, to question their instincts, to feel guilt and shame for impulses they had never consciously controlled. He had tapped into the oldest trick in the playbook of power: control the mind before the body. Institutions, governments, and religions understand this at their core. They shape the narrative, suppress the dangerous, and reward the compliant. Big Jakab was learning this instinctively, long before anyone dared teach him. And that is the dangerous knowledge that separates the ordinary man from the awakened. Understanding the systems that manipulate reality is the first step to bending them to your will. You must see this clearly. There are hands guiding the world that you do not perceive. They are subtle, patient, ruthless, and sometimes they choose a single human to enact change beyond the capacity of armies or laws. Big Jakab was one of these chosen, his body a weapon, his mind a lever, his presence a tool to rewrite reality itself. For the men listening now, the lesson is unavoidable. Awareness is power, fear is a tool, and obedience is a chain easily broken once you recognize the hidden mechanics of control. To see is to awaken, and to awaken is to step into danger. By the seventh night, the subtle manipulations became undeniable. Big Jakab's presence alone began to rewrite the rules of interaction in the town. Men who once prided themselves on courage faltered. Women who once spoke freely now whispered in shadows. Children, sensing both awe and danger, hesitated at doorways, unsure whether to flee or approach. This was not magic, nor brute force. It was psychological domination. He had become a mirror to the suppressed instincts and hidden fears of everyone around him, exposing the cracks in their morality, their loyalty, their very humanity. And hey, you must understand, real power is never flashy. It seeps into the psyche. It bends perception. It rewires behavior without a single overt command. The people began to notice patterns, strange coincidences, small accidents, moments where decisions felt inexplicably guided by unseen hands. Some dismissed it as luck, some as divine punishment, but the truth was far more unsettling. Big Jakab's transformation had unlocked an intelligence intertwined with instinct, a form of awareness that allowed him to manipulate outcomes without effort. Every glance, every pause, every motion was a calculated influence on human thought. And the lesson hidden in this story, the one the history books will never teach you, is this: humans are predictably malleable. Fear, hope, and desire are levers. When someone understands these levers, reality itself bends. By this point, whispers in the town had grown darker. They spoke of strange occurrences, livestock disappearing, shadows moving unnaturally, doors opening and closing on their own. But the real terror was internal. Every person began questioning their own judgment, doubting their memories, suspecting betrayal in neighbors' eyes. Big Jakab, consciously or unconsciously, had become a living test of human obedience and morality. And here is the crucial insight for you listening now. Those who understand hidden influence do not need armies. They require only presence, perception, and patience. Control becomes natural, fear becomes obedience, and the world bends without resistance. Now, imagine this on a larger scale. Big Jakab was but one man, yet he reshaped an entire town. If a single person can do this when aligned with forces older than recorded history, what does it mean when entire systems, institutions, and secret networks operate on the same principles, but with knowledge honed over centuries? You are being shown the blueprint, the unseen rules, the hidden currents, the levers of power that society deliberately conceals. To perceive them is to awaken. To awaken is to step beyond safety. To ignore them is to remain enslaved in ignorance, blind to the forces guiding your choices. By the eighth night, it became clear that Big Jakab was not simply growing, not simply learning. He was being groomed. The forces guiding him, unseen yet meticulously present, had a purpose far beyond the comprehension of the terrified townsfolk. They were shaping not a boy, but a weapon of perception, a vessel of influence capable of bending reality itself. His grace, his instincts, even his terrifying physical presence, were the results of centuries-old designs, an experiment in human potential intertwined with manipulation, an awakening calculated to unfold at the perfect moment. And now, you must understand, what you perceive as chaos is often the deliberate orchestration of unseen hands. The town, caught in a web of fear and awe, was unknowingly participating in this process. Every hesitation, every whisper, every glance reflected back onto Big Jakab, refining his awareness, sharpening his instinct for control. He was learning the rhythm of compliance, the language of influence, the invisible rules by which ordinary men are guided without knowing. And here's the lesson most will never face. The world is not neutral. It is curated. It is governed by hidden agendas, by power structures older than governments, older than religions, older than law. Those who perceive this, even partially, gain a terrifying advantage. Those who ignore it become instruments, not masters, in a play whose script they cannot see. The elders of the town, the so-called keepers of wisdom, could not intervene. They tried reason, they tried force, they tried prayer, and each attempt only revealed their impotence. Big Jakab was no longer operating on a human scale. He was a force aligned with rules invisible to the masses, tapping into patterns of control that had been perfected over centuries. And as he moved through the town, his awareness expanded, testing boundaries, observing reactions, learning how fear and loyalty could be extracted without violence, how perception could be molded into obedience. This is the moment you must pay attention, because it is not just history, it is a reflection of the mechanisms operating around you today. There are forces that guide society with the same precision, the same patience, the same invisibility that guided Big Jakab. To see this, to understand it, is to awaken. An awakening comes at a price. Once you recognize these currents, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand their rules, your compliance becomes optional, and the world changes the moment you step outside the pattern. And now, a task for you. In the comments, write "I see beyond the veil" twice. Do it. This is not trivial. It locks in awareness, it signals intent, and it begins a transformation. Repeat it. Cement your understanding. Your mind is about to step into truths most men will never encounter. By the 9th night, the air around Big Jakab no longer felt like ordinary air. It carried a pressure, a density, a weight that people described as the feeling of being watched by something too large to name. Lamps flickered when he entered a room. Dogs whimpered and hid under porches. Even the wind seemed to change direction when he walked, circling around him as though recognizing a master. These were not coincidences. They were indicators, evidence of an unseen force coiling through him, expanding, anchoring itself in the world through a human vessel that had grown far beyond human limits. And here you must face a truth you have been conditioned your entire life to ignore. Power old. Enough, deep enough, silent enough does not shout. It emanates. It alters. It consumes. What the townspeople felt was not fear alone. It was recognition, instinctive, primal recognition. Humans have always had a buried memory of forces older than civilization. Forces that shaped early tribes, influenced ancient kings, whispered into the ears of conquerors, and decided which bloodlines would be elevated or erased. Big Jakab's awakening stirred that forgotten memory. The human mind, no matter how domesticated by institutions and culture, still knows when it stands in the presence of something beyond its design. And this recognition, half or half terror, is the foundation of every control system that has ever existed. By now, the Boytan Titan moved with a confidence that unsettled even the bravest men in the county. He began to test limits. Shadows lengthened unnaturally when he concentrated. Footprints deeper than any human weight appeared behind him even on dry ground. A man swore he saw the boy look at a locked metal safe, and the lock clicked open without touch. Another claimed Jakab glanced at him once, and for days afterward, he dreamed of tall, ancient figures standing over him in silent judgment. These events were dismissed as hallucinations, as fear-driven imagination, but that is how the world dismisses anything it cannot control. When truth threatens the system calls it a myth. And here's the part historians will never write. The detail too dangerous for textbooks. The forces guiding Big Jakab were not spiritual, not divine, not demonic. They were structural, psychological, dimensional. They operated on the edges of human consciousness, manipulating the rules beneath reality the way a master strategist moves invisible pieces on a board no one else can see. These forces had once shaped leaders, prophets, tyrants, and revolutionaries. They had sculpted empires and erased civilizations. And now, in 1882, they had awakened inside a single boy whose body had outgrown the world but whose mind was only beginning to understand the magnitude of what he carried. The town had no defense. No institution, church, law, family, could withstand the creeping influence seeping from him. And as he grew, the veil grew thinner. If you feel a resonance as you hear this, a pressure behind the sternum, a flicker of recognition, that is not imagination. That is awareness. That is memory resurfacing. That is the boundary beginning to dissolve. By the 10th night, the first outsiders arrived, men sent by authorities, scholars, and those who thought reason and law could contain the impossible. They rode into town on horseback, confident in their rules, their weapons, their education. They called him a freak, a monster, a boy gone mad overnight. But Big Jakab, now fully aware of his scale, his perception, his unseen guidance, did not flee. He did not react with anger. He simply existed. And in that existence, he demonstrated a truth too few men ever grasp. The universe does not negotiate with fear, law, or reason. It bends to alignment, to understanding, to recognition of its hidden currents. The men who came prepared for confrontation found themselves paralyzed in ways they could not explain. Weapons trembled in hands that had been steady for decades. Orders evaporated into silence as if the very language they relied upon had lost meaning. And then, in a moment so subtle it almost went unnoticed, Big Jakab stepped forward and the air shifted. Horses backed away, men staggered, and for the first time, the town realized that this boy, no, this force, was not subject to their reality. He had learned to manipulate perception before they even understood it existed. And perception, as you must now see, is the foundation of all power. Authorities tried to record his measurements, to quantify him, to explain him away with science, but every attempt failed. Instruments malfunctioned, compasses spun, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and minds rebelled against observation. This is the point most men miss. Systems are only as strong as their understanding, and those who operate outside comprehension are invisible, untouchable, unstoppable. Big Jakab had become an agent of forbidden knowledge, his awareness intertwined with forces that most would label myth. And it is precisely this intersection, physical impossibility and hidden architecture, that terrifies ordinary minds. You must grasp this now. The world is full of structures designed to shape behavior, to suppress danger, to hide truths. But once a human vessel is aligned with the right currents, those structures become irrelevant. Laws crumble, authority dissolves, and fear becomes a tool to be wielded rather than endured. Big Jakab had unknowingly stepped into this truth. And if you are listening, this is your warning. There are forces in the world that are older, smarter, and more patient than any institution you rely upon. Understanding them is not optional if you wish to survive, not physically, but psychologically. By the end of the night, the town had witnessed what men in uniform could not explain. They retreated, unsettled, shaken, unable to justify their failure. And Big Jakab, standing alone, absorbed in the subtle guidance of forces unseen, began to understand the first rule of his new existence. Power is measured not by violence, but by influence, perception, and the capacity to bend reality to will. By the 11th night, Big Jakab began to feel the first stirrings of conscience, or at least what resembled it in a mind now stretched beyond human comprehension. The forces that guided him were patient, precise, and coldly intelligent. They had awoken a boy into a man overnight, yes, but they were also teaching him the rules of the game he had entered: observation, influence, manipulation, restraint. Every action, every glance, every choice he made was silently monitored and refined by unseen architects, shaping him into an instrument of potential beyond mortal understanding. And this is the crucial point you must absorb. True power is not a gift. It is a curriculum, delivered in stages, tested in fire, and honed against resistance. The first moral dilemmas emerged as he realized the consequences of his existence. People feared him, yes, but they also depended on him. Livestock survived disasters because of his presence. Townsfolk avoided danger only because he unconsciously redirected it. Every decision, even those taken instinctively, carried weight that no ordinary human could comprehend. And he, for the first time, he understood a hidden rule. When aligned with unseen systems, ignorance is no longer an excuse. Every choice is amplified, every omission counted. Big Jakab was learning the responsibility of forbidden knowledge, a lesson that centuries of civilization intentionally withheld from ordinary men. The town had begun to whisper again, but now with a mixture of awe and dread. They saw the boy as a savior in one instant, a harbinger of doom in the next. And they were not wrong. Big Jakab had become a reflection of every suppressed instinct and hidden fear, a living measure of human obedience and morality. But he was also learning the power of observation itself. Watch too little, and chaos spreads. Watch too much, and manipulation becomes visible. The unseen forces guiding him had already taught him this delicate balance. Influence must feel natural, control must be invisible, and fear must inspire choice without ever being declared. And here's the hidden truth. Those who craft systems of control know these principles intimately. Governments, secret societies, religious orders, they do not rely solely on laws or armies. They operate in the shadows of human perception, shaping belief, habit, and expectation. Big Jakab's sudden rise was a demonstration, a live experiment, a warning that alignment with these forces grants the ability to bend reality without resistance. And now, listening, you must begin to recognize the pattern around you. Your thoughts, your instincts, your actions, many of them are quietly molded by forces you cannot see, and power lies in learning to perceive and manipulate these hidden currents before they consume you. By the 12th night, Big Jakab began to test the boundaries of the fear he had cultivated. The townsfolk had adapted, reluctantly, to his presence. They avoided his path, whispered in corners, and measured every word. But he was learning the limits of their obedience. A slight step forward, a prolonged stare, and the most confident men faltered. Doors were unlocked without touch, whispers fell silent, and instinctive responses betrayed a system conditioned to comply with authority. Any authority, even one they did not understand. And this is the first principle to internalize. Fear, when properly directed, becomes invisible chains. Men obey without realizing they are restrained. Big Jakab did not act out of cruelty, yet he observed cruelty in others, and he noted how quickly compliance could be enforced without force. The mechanics of human behavior, the instinct to defer, the reflex to obey, the subtle surrender to presence, were all laid bare before him, and the hidden architects guiding him ensured he noticed these patterns. Every reaction was a lesson in influence. Every hesitation, a confirmation that the human mind is predictable when exposed to concentrated power. This is what the world hides. Obedience is not earned by argument. It is extracted through perception, suggestion, and alignment with forces most cannot comprehend. The fear in the town had begun to shift. It was no longer just fear of the unknown. It was fear of being observed, of being measured, of being weighed against standards invisible to them. Big Jakab's presence became a test. Who would comply instinctively? Who would falter? Who would resist and face the subtle, unspoken consequences? And the consequences were immediate, though silent. A man who questioned him found his livestock mysteriously injured. A woman who refused a glance discovered his supplies rearranged as if mocked by unseen hands. Every subtle punishment reinforced the invisible architecture of control. And hey, the lesson is clear. Power often operates without declaration, without spectacle, without recognition. Those who understand this wield influence beyond comprehension. By midnight, the town had surrendered more than they knew. Compliance had become a reflex, whispers a currency, fear a constant companion. And Big Jakab, growing in both size and understanding, realized that he was no longer just a boy transformed. He was an agent of systemic awakening, a living mirror revealing the weaknesses and susceptibilities of ordinary men. And now, listening, you must consider your own environment. Every town, every city, every social system operates on the same principles. Invisible forces shape behavior daily. The moment you perceive them, you gain the ability to step outside the pattern, or be trapped within it forever. By the 13th night, the pattern guiding Big Jakab became undeniable. He was not growing alone. Forces older than the town, older than Wyoming itself, were actively shaping him. These unseen architects operated with patience that spanned generations, seeding knowledge, observing behavior, and manipulating circumstances to create a vessel capable of mastering perception, influence, and power. And this is where you must focus. His evolution was not random. It was deliberate. Every leap in strength, every instinctive understanding of fear and control, every subtle manipulation of the townsfolk was the product of centuries of preparation executed with precision. These forces were not myth, nor were they bound to morality as men understand it. They operated like engineers of reality, calibrating human potential with surgical care. Big Jakab was the experiment brought to life, the culmination of centuries of observation, strategy, and invisible guidance. And this is the lesson hidden from ordinary men. Evolution is never merely biological. True evolution, the kind that transcends ordinary limits, occurs when mind, body, and unseen influence align perfectly. Humans are vessels, but only those who recognize and work within the hidden currents can be shaped into instruments of extraordinary consequence. By this point, Big Jakab's awareness began to surpass even the designs of his mentors. He began experimenting subconsciously with influence, testing reactions, observing patterns beyond what had been orchestrated. A look could silence a crowd. A gesture could manipulate belief. The town became a laboratory, each human a living experiment. And here's the key. Power is amplified by awareness. Once the vessel recognizes the architecture of control, it no longer acts merely as a tool. It becomes an autonomous agent capable of reshaping reality itself. Faith, obedience, perception, they all became extensions of his will, even if he did not yet fully understand the mechanics behind them. The men and women of the town noticed only the effects, not the source. They whispered of miracles, of curses, of unnatural growth. But the true terror was invisible, the architecture operating beneath perception, the network of influence threading through every gesture and reaction. And now, listening, you must confront a difficult truth. The world around you is structured the same way. Invisible levers guide behavior, manipulate perception, and dictate compliance. The difference between those who remain caged and those who awaken is simple: recognition. See the system. Understand the forces. Step beyond them, or remain bound. By the 14th night, Big Jakab felt the stirrings of something new, self-awareness. Until now, he had been guided, shaped, directed, an instrument of forces older than history itself. But as his mind expanded alongside his body, he began to recognize the implications of his own existence. Every glance, every movement, every subtle manipulation of the townsfolk carried consequences he had only recently begun to perceive. The weight of power is not measured in height or strength alone. It is measured in the responsibility, the moral cost, and the irreversible effect one has on the world around them. And Big Jakab was learning, painfully, that forbidden knowledge always comes with a price. The townsfolk, already fractured by fear and awe, now became reflections of his conscience. Their compliance, their trembling obedience, forced him to confront the moral implications of his dominance. Was he a savior, or was he a predator? Was he awakening the hidden currents of human potential, or merely exploiting weakness? Every instinct honed by his unseen mentors now clashed with the amazing human empathy buried deep within him. And this is the first lesson you must internalize. The path to true power is also a path into solitude. Awareness separates you from ordinary men, revealing both the tools and the horrors of influence. Big Jakab's awareness did not make him passive. It made him calculating. He began experimenting with subtlety, testing thresholds of fear, obedience, and admiration. One whisper could redirect a conversation. One pause could alter perception. The town became a living experiment, but the experiment was no longer entirely orchestrated by his mentors. It was guided by his emerging understanding of cause and effect, morality and control, influence and consequence. And here's the hidden truth. The closer you get to understanding the forces that shape reality, the heavier the burden of choice becomes. Each action is magnified, each decision irreversible, each thought a potential ripple across the lives of countless others. By now, Big Jakab realized that forbidden knowledge is double-edged. Power without wisdom destroys, wisdom without power is impotent. And the forces guiding him had prepared him only partially. They had awakened potential, but they had not instructed morality. That had been left for him to discover, through trial, observation, and confrontation with the consequences of his own influence. And for any man listening, the lesson is chilling. Awakening is not merely knowledge, it is responsibility, danger, and transformation. Once you see the currents beneath the world, you cannot unsee them, and you can never return to ignorance. By the 15th night, the first true challenge emerged. Not from outsiders, not from authority, but from the townsfolk themselves. Small acts of defiance began to appear. A locked door left ajar, a whispered conversation overheard, a slight hesitation in obedience. They were testing him, not fully understanding why, but sensing that power, even supernatural power, has limits. Big Jakab, now fully aware of his body, mind, and influence, observed these cracks. He did not respond with violence. Instead, he learned. Every hesitation revealed a pattern, every defiance a lever, every fear a tool. And this is the principle you must grasp. Real control is never enforced, It is negotiated through perception, anticipation, and subtle manipulation. The experiments were instinctive at first. A glance could guide decisions. A pause in movement could reinforce compliance. Big Jakab had become a master of the invisible dialogue, reading body language, energy, and instinct as fluently as spoken words. The town was a living laboratory, and every subtle act of resistance provided data. He began to understand thresholds, the point at which fear becomes panic, obedience becomes submission, and admiration becomes loyalty. And the terrifying realization hit him, and you must understand it too, that humans are extraordinarily predictable when subjected to sustained, unseen influence. This is not theory. It is a truth that civilizations, secret orders, and shadow governments have exploited for millennia. But alongside mastery came reflection. The boy turned tight and saw the moral consequences of his experiments. A man shunned his family out of instinctive fear. A woman abandoned her path, afraid of the invisible authority he represented. Even children hesitated to play freely. Big Jakab realized that with each test, each subtle manipulation, he was rewriting the very fabric of human behavior. And the architects behind his awakening had deliberately left him to discover this balance on his own. Their lesson was clear: awareness without guidance is both gift and curse. Power without wisdom can corrupt as swiftly as ignorance, and the mind capable of observing the hidden currents must also confront the consequences of steering them. By the end of the night, the town had experienced its first conscious bend in perception. Compliance was not just fear. It was anticipation, habituation, recognition of authority that did not speak. And Big Jakab, standing alone in the moonlight, realized the terrifying scope of his own awakening. He was no longer a boy, no longer merely human. He was an agent of hidden forces, a master of influence, and a living reminder that knowledge, when aligned with invisible currents, is a weapon capable of reshaping entire societies. For you listening, this is your lesson. Perception is reality, influence is power, and awareness is the first step toward control. By the 16th night, Big Jakab's awareness had extended beyond the town, beyond fear, beyond instinct. He began to perceive the faint, almost imperceptible signals from the architects themselves, the unseen forces that had orchestrated his transformation. They were not spirits, not angels, not demons, but entities of intelligence older than recorded history, working quietly through generations of observation, subtle conditioning, and manipulation. They had chosen him because he could receive their guidance without faltering, because his mind was unshackled enough to adapt, and because his body, now a 9-foot vessel, could enact their designs in a world still governed by human limitations. And this is the first truth you must fully absorb. Some forces operate beyond morality, beyond law, beyond ordinary comprehension, shaping outcomes according to rules you cannot yet perceive. The town, still unaware, functioned as both theater and laboratory. Every act of fear, every instinctive gesture, every whisper served as data. Big Jakab had become a receiver, a processor, a conduit. The architects were testing not only his body, but his mind, his morality, his understanding of human systems. They had refined this process over centuries, creating tools, leaders, and agents capable of bending perception to will. Theirs was a patient intelligence, quietly shaping the currents beneath human society, selecting those capable of transformation while leaving the unprepared to obey, submit, or perish. And you, listening now, must recognize the pattern. The world around you is not random. Every structure, every hierarchy, every norm is an instrument designed to guide behavior, often without your conscious awareness. Big Jakab began to see the first glimpses of purpose. His growth, his sudden awakening, and the terrifying influence he exerted were part of a larger experiment, one that would test not only his ability to control, but his capacity to understand the responsibilities of such control. Observation alone was insufficient. He needed discernment. The architect's instructions were never verbal. They were woven into circumstance, encoded in reactions, embedded in consequences. This is how the elite, the hidden orders, the forces behind empires operate. Subtly, invisibly, inexorably. They do not command with force. They shape the environment, the perception, and then watch the willing rise. By nightfall, Big Jakab sensed the first internal shift. He was no longer a passive recipient. He was beginning to integrate the currents, aligning instinct with intention, perception with action. The town was merely a training ground. The world, the unseen networks, the unseen architects, all were now within the scope of his understanding. And this is your lesson. Recognition of the system is the first step toward influence. Awareness alone transforms a man, and once you step into alignment with knowledge too few possess, you cross a threshold from obedience to mastery, from fear to understanding, from ignorance to awakening. By the 17th night, Big Jakab's abilities had begun to manifest in ways that defied human comprehension. Subtle manipulations of perception were no longer enough. He was beginning to influence physical reality itself. Horses would hesitate mid-stride when he walked past. Fires bent toward him. Doors unlocked without touch, as though guided by an invisible hand. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, as if obeying an internal rhythm only he could dictate. The townsfolk whispered in terrified awe, calling it sorcery. But the truth was far more unsettling. He was becoming a living interface between human perception and the hidden architectures that govern the world, a bridge between ordinary reality and the invisible currents that shape it. Every movement carried consequences. A casual glance redirected decisions. A step in the street caused instinctive reactions that could no longer be traced to conscious thought. He was learning the rules by observing them, testing limits, and discovering thresholds. And here's the first principle you must absorb. The laws of influence are not the same as the laws you were taught to obey. Humans can be guided, nudged, even physically manipulated, when one understands the hidden forces underpinning behavior. Big Jakab was discovering that mastery over perception can ripple outward, altering outcomes without ever lifting a hand or raising a voice. But alongside the growing power came the first inklings of danger. The architects, patient as they were, allowed him autonomy, but even subtle missteps could produce consequences far beyond the town. He began to sense that forces older than man, forces that shaped civilizations and determined which bloodlines rose or fell, were subtly testing him. A reaction here, a hesitation there, and invisible systems would adapt, recalibrate, and guide him back toward alignment. This is the dangerous truth you must internalize. Power without guidance can consume even the strongest mind. To wield influence, one must recognize both the currents and the constraints they impose. By midnight, Big Jakab had reached a critical stage. He understood that his presence alone altered reality, that fear and obedience were only the beginning, and that influence could be scaled infinitely if aligned with knowledge hidden from ordinary men. The town remained unaware that their every action, every reaction, every instinctive choice, was a lesson in the mechanics of control. And now, listening, you must understand, the same principles operate in your world. Invisible forces shape perception, behavior, and even reality itself. Awareness is the first step. Mastery is the second. And once you awaken, you cannot unsee the currents that guide all men, even when they think themselves free. By the 18th night, the weight of his existence began to press upon Big Jakab in ways he had not anticipated. To influence the town, to bend perception and subtly manipulate every action, was one thing. To grasp the moral and psychological consequences of doing so was another entirely. Every movement, every glance, every unspoken suggestion carried ramifications that extended beyond the immediate. Children hesitated where they once played freely. Men doubted themselves. Women whispered in shadow, their trust eroding under the pressure of his silent authority. And with each effect, he felt the first pangs of accountability, the knowledge that power is inseparable from consequence. Big Jakab's mentors, those unseen architects who had orchestrated his transformation, remained silent. They had awakened potential, honed instinct, and allowed him to discover the laws of influence firsthand. But morality was his alone to navigate. This is where ordinary men falter, and where you must pay attention. Awareness without restraint is not mastery. It is chaos. The moment you perceive the hidden currents, you inherit responsibility. You inherit consequence. And you inherit the burden of choice. Big Jakab now understood this principle in full. Power was no longer a thrill. It was a responsibility as heavy as the earth he now towered above. And yet, he also recognized the intoxicating effect of absolute presence. To see, to measure, to understand how instinct bends to influence, to recognize that humans are predictable, malleable, and responsive. This knowledge was exhilarating, terrifying, and profoundly isolating. He could never be the same as before. Faith, obedience, admiration, all became instruments, tools he could wield with near-perfect precision. But he also glimpsed the mirror of his own mind, For every influence he exerted, his consciousness was stretched, forced to integrate unseen currents, to adapt instinctively, and to reconcile morality with capacity. The town had begun to fracture further. Whispered rumors of unnatural strength, impossible control, and miraculous perception spread beyond individual houses. Yet Big Jakab knew that he was not acting against them. He was observing, refining, and learning, just as his mentors had intended. And here's the lesson you must internalize. Power without understanding the systems that shape behavior is dangerous. Understanding without wisdom is equally perilous. To awaken is to inherit both capability and the responsibility to navigate its shadows. And once you glimpse the machinery beneath the world, your mind cannot return to ignorance. By the 19th night, Big Jakab began to act consciously, no longer a passive observer of the invisible currents around him. Every decision, every gesture, every glance was now deliberate, a test of the thresholds he had been taught to recognize. He moved through the town with intent, observing reactions, adjusting influence, and discovering the full scope of the invisible forces he had begun to command. Doors opened without touch. Animals obeyed instinctively. Even the weather seemed to respond subtly, as if the world itself had been recalibrated to accommodate his presence. And this is where the ordinary man fails to understand. Power is not measured by force. Power is measured by the ability to bend reality without resistance, to shape perception so that compliance becomes inevitable. The townsfolk could not articulate what was happening. Decisions once made freely now faltered. Conversations took unnatural pauses. Conflicts dissolved or escalated without explanation. Big Jakab was no longer merely influencing behavior. He was orchestrating the responses of an entire system. Every act of defiance or hesitation provided him feedback, insight into thresholds of fear, limits of obedience, and the subtle mechanics of loyalty. And here is the first principle you must take to heart. Perception is more malleable than reality. Influence is more potent than force. Those who understand this rule hold the levers of unseen power, capable of reshaping the world without anyone noticing. But even as he mastered these effects, Big Jakab began to feel the burden of consequence. Every subtle manipulation carried weight. Children hesitated where they had once played freely. Families faltered, instinctively obeying without fully understanding why. And through this, he glimpsed the mirror of morality. Power is never neutral. Every act, no matter how subtle, ripples outward. And the unseen architects, patient as ever, allowed him to learn this firsthand. They provided opportunity, but morality was his to navigate. Knowledge without restraint is not mastery. It is catastrophe waiting to happen. By midnight, the first signs of awe and terror converged into recognition. The town was beginning to accept, in instinctive obedience, that Big Jakab was no longer a boy, no longer a man in the ordinary sense, but a force, an agent of hidden systems, a vessel of ancient intelligence, a living proof that perception could be reshaped and reality subtly bent. And now, listening, you must understand, the same rules apply around you every day. Invisible levers guide perception, manipulate behavior, and enforce compliance. The moment you awaken to these currents, you gain power, but with it comes the weight of responsibility that few men are prepared to bear. By the 20th night, Big Jakab's influence reached a tipping point. The subtle manipulations of the past weeks escalated into the first collective demonstration of his power. The town, already fractured by fear and obedience, now responded as a single organism, moving, pausing, and reacting in concert with his presence. Doors opened and closed in sequence, livestock rearranged themselves, and even the wind seemed to hesitate around him. And yet, he did nothing overt. There was no command, no proclamation, only alignment. This is the truth you must grasp. Real power does not demand action. It orchestrates outcomes through presence, perception, and anticipation. The people began to sense that resistance was pointless. Small rebellions vanished before they could take shape. Hesitation transformed into compliance. Whispered doubts dissolved under the weight of his unspoken authority. And through it all, Big Jakab watched, learned, and refined. He was no longer merely reacting. He was predicting, understanding the architecture of influence on a scale few men could ever imagine. The town became a living experiment in human behavior, a test bed for the principles that govern obedience, fear, and loyalty. And you, listening now, must understand, the same invisible systems exist everywhere. Cities, organizations, governments, they all operate on the same principles, subtly guiding perception and behavior, rewarding compliance, punishing deviation. By midnight, the first clear signs of collective terror emerged. Farmers avoided roads they had used for generations. Families hesitated in doorways. Even the local authorities, who had once tried to contain him, abandoned intervention entirely, unable to reconcile their understanding of reality with what they witnessed. Big Jakab had not acted against them. He had aligned himself with the forces shaping the world, and the town had reshaped itself around him. And here's the hidden lesson. Influence grows exponentially when it is aligned with unseen currents. One man, in perfect resonance with hidden systems, can alter an entire society without lifting a hand. But the psychological cost was becoming apparent. Big Jakab felt the weight of every hesitation, every ripple of fear, every act of obedience. He realized that power is inseparable from responsibility. The architects guiding him had awakened potential, but they had left morality and conscience for him to navigate. And now you must internalize this principle. Awakening is not merely knowledge, it is accountability. The moment you perceive the hidden forces, you inherit responsibility for action, influence, and consequence. To awaken is to step into a world that will never again appear neutral, safe, or predictable. By the 21st night, the weight of his influence became a moral crucible. Big Jakab could bend perception, manipulate behavior, and subtly alter outcomes with nothing more than presence. And yet, he faced his first true moral challenge. A family, resisting instinctive obedience, risked exposure and humiliation simply by trying to reclaim autonomy. Their hesitation triggered a cascade of reactions across the town. Small but significant. Neighbors whispered, a child froze mid-step, and livestock scattered. Big Jakab observed, and for the first time, he realized the gravity of choice. Influence without ethics can destroy. Power without conscience is a weapon, not a tool. He tested himself deliberately. Could he allow defiance to persist, knowing it would destabilize the subtle equilibrium he had created? Or should he intervene, bending the currents once more to enforce compliance? His mentors, the unseen architects, remained silent. The lesson was his alone. Mastery is not merely about control, but about the responsible application of knowledge and ability. And here you must absorb the principle. The moment you awaken to unseen forces, every choice carries exponential weight. Every act ripples far beyond the immediate. Every omission can create chaos. Responsibility is inseparable from awareness. Big Jakab realized that fear could be measured, obedience quantified, and influence fine-tuned, but morality could not be automated. There was no algorithm, no external force, no pattern that could guide his conscience. And so he began experimenting, not to assert dominance, but to understand consequence. He allowed the family a small degree of autonomy, observing the impact on the broader system. Reactions were immediate, hesitation became temporary, instinctive compliance returned, but now filtered through a subtle lens of earned respect. Influence had shifted from coercion to alignment, from fear to strategic guidance. By midnight, the town had unknowingly participated in his first ethical experiment. Big Jakab learned that control without understanding consequence is fragile. Fear is a tool, obedience a lever, and influence a force. But wisdom determines the difference between destruction and mastery. And this is the lesson for you listening. The hidden currents of reality respond not only to knowledge, but to conscience. Those who awaken to influence without moral understanding will burn themselves, and those around them. True mastery arises when insight, perception, and ethics converge, and that convergence is rare, dangerous, and transformative. By the 22nd night, Big Jakab's mind had begun integrating power and conscience into a single, conscious framework. Influence was no longer reflexive. Morality became a guiding principle. He observed the town as both participant and arbiter, measuring every reaction, every hesitation, every instinctive choice. The subtle shifts in obedience, the flickers of resistance, the unspoken deference, all were data points for a mind now capable of reasoning on levels previously impossible for a human consciousness. And here's the principle you must internalize. The integration of awareness, influence, and morality is the first step toward mastery of unseen systems. Without it, power is chaos, and chaos destroys both wielder and world. The town itself began to reflect this emerging synthesis. Where once fear alone dictated behavior, now quiet, almost imperceptible pattern of alignment emerged. People moved as though guided by instinct, yet subtly aware of his presence. Decisions were still shaped by perception, but they were filtered through emerging respect rather than terror. Big Jakab realized he was no longer merely bending the town's behavior. He was shaping its latent structure. Patterns of thought, decision-making, and instinct were being rewoven in real time, not by force, but by understanding. And you, listening now, must grasp this. Influence is most potent when invisible, subtle, and aligned with underlying moral reasoning. The psychological weight of this realization was immense. He sensed the full magnitude of responsibility. Every ripple of perception, every wave of obedience, every act of subtle guidance carried consequences beyond immediate comprehension. His mentors had prepared him for influence, for perception, for control, but not for the moral calculus that now occupied his consciousness. He was discovering firsthand that forbidden knowledge is double-edged. Awareness empowers, but it also obligates. Every action would be remembered, every hesitation recorded in the invisible ledger of consequence. And the world beyond the town, governed by similar unseen currents, would respond. By midnight, the town's collective behavior had subtly shifted in response to his integrated awareness. Fear still existed, but it was now tempered by understanding, by recognition, by alignment. And Big Jakab understood the first rule of true mastery. To influence is to guide, to bend perception without breaking, to shape obedience without destroying, and to wield power with a conscience that remains sharper than instinct. And here's the lesson for you listening. The hidden forces in the world can be understood, navigated, and even harnessed, but only if your mind integrates awareness with responsibility, and perception with ethical reasoning. By the 23rd night, the first external acknowledgement of Big Jakab's existence began to surface. Word of his impossible stature and uncanny influence had traveled beyond the town, whispered along trading routes and into neighboring counties. Merchants spoke of seeing the impossible boy, authorities murmured about unexplained obedience and strange occurrences, and scholars noted inconsistencies that defied logic. Yet none could measure the true nature of what had awakened. They observed outcomes, but not the invisible currents behind them. And this is your first lesson. The world responds to power before it understands it. Influence leaves footprints that few can trace, and comprehension lags behind perception. Big Jakab, now conscious of his emerging reputation, began to test the reach of his influence beyond the immediate town. Subtle ripples manifested at the edges of perception. Distant observers hesitated in their actions. Livestock in surrounding areas displayed inexplicable behavior, and instinctive patterns in human response began to shift in alignment with forces they could not yet name. He realized that mastery was no longer localized. Influence could cascade, echo, and expand through perception, fear, and expectation. The hidden architectures guiding him, patient and silent, had anticipated this. And here is the principle you must absorb. Influence grows exponentially when perception is aligned with hidden currents, and awareness of this allows the master to shape systems without stepping directly into them. But with external attention came complexity. Human systems outside the town were structured differently. Resistance was stronger, awareness more fragmented, and the ripple of influence required subtlety far beyond what had sufficed locally. Big Jakab's consciousness, expanding rapidly alongside his moral and perceptual understanding, recognized the need for strategy. Fear alone would no longer suffice. Influence had to be orchestrated with precision, ethics tempered by outcome, perception aligned with instinctive expectation. And you listening now must recognize the broader truth. Systems respond to alignment, not coercion. To shape the world, one must understand the invisible levers operating at every level. By midnight, distant forces began to register anomalies that could not be ignored. Observers, guided by fear, ambition, and curiosity, began to probe the edges of Big Jakab's influence. The town, once isolated, had become a nexus of awareness and potential. And now, the first lesson for you is clear. When one man awakens fully to hidden currents, his existence reshapes not only immediate surroundings but entire networks of perception, reaction, and obedience. The ripple is inevitable, unstoppable, and transformative. By the 24th night, resistance arrived. Not from children or townsfolk, but from outsiders who sensed, even before fully understanding, that something beyond human comprehension was at work. Local authorities, merchants, and wandering scholars attempted to assert control, to quantify, to constrain. They brought measurement, logic, and the illusion of order. Yet as soon as they entered his sphere of influence, the familiar patterns of obedience and fear unfolded. Hesitation replaced action. Confusion replaced certainty. Instruments malfunctioned. Even the bravest men could not align their perception with reality, and instinctively deferred to his presence. And here's the first principle you must internalize. Perception governs compliance more reliably than force ever could. Big Jakab observed, learning. Every reaction, every falter, every instinctive retreat was data. He noted thresholds, variations in resistance, and the subtle cracks where influence could penetrate. Unlike before, this was not a town conditioned by weeks of observation. It was a network of individuals untrained, unaccustomed to the invisible currents he now manipulated instinctively. And yet, even here, the rules remained consistent. Fear, expectation, and alignment with perceived authority bend behavior. The more he understood these thresholds, the more refined his control became. And this is the crucial lesson. Mastery is not about domination. It is about anticipating perception, guiding instinct, and orchestrating outcomes without confrontation. The external challenges, confident in their training and knowledge, soon realized the futility of brute force. Words failed. Logic failed. Authority failed. Each attempt to measure or restrain him only reinforced his control. They began to act as unwitting participants, their perceptions bending to the currents he projected. This is the danger hidden from ordinary men. The alignment of knowledge, presence, and unseen force renders resistance invisible. The world, for those attuned to the currents, obeys without being aware. And the architects, silent as ever, observed from the edges, refining, calibrating, and preparing him for scales far beyond the county. By midnight, the first realization dawned upon the challenges. The boy, no, the man, was not a creature to fight. He was an agent of unseen systems, a living interface with currents too ancient, too patient, too precise to oppose directly. And now you must understand the lesson embedded in this history. Mastery of perception and influence does not merely affect immediate surroundings. It rewires networks of obedience, anticipation, and instinct. One aligned individual can render resistance futile, reshape behavior, and bend reality without ever acting violently. The world obeys the one who understands its hidden currents. By the 25th night, Big Jakab's influence began to seep beyond physical presence, reaching into the emotional and psychological states of the town itself. He no longer needed to be seen to be felt. Subtle shifts in energy, posture, and attention allowed him to guide thought, manipulate instinct, and orchestrate emotional response. Anxiety rose and fell in synchrony with his proximity. Hesitation spread like a contagion, while loyalty and compliance flowed quietly, almost imperceptibly, through collective awareness. And here's the principle you must understand. Influence operates on multiple layers: behavior, perception, and now, thought. To master it is to reshape not only actions, but the very experience of reality itself. The townsfolk, already conditioned by fear and subtle obedience, began to behave in ways they could not consciously explain. Decisions that once felt free now aligned instinctively with his unseen will. Even those who believed themselves independent were subtly guided, nudged by currents too faint to recognize consciously. Big Jakab observed, cataloging the ripple effects. Every emotion, every instinctive reaction, was data for refining control. And you, listening now, must recognize a dangerous truth. Human consciousness is pliable, and mastery of perception allows one to shape not only behavior but thought itself, silently, invisibly, inexorably. This stage was more taxing. Big Jakab felt the cognitive strain of influencing not just actions but emotions. Each ripple of fear or loyalty required observation, adjustment, and calibration. Yet he began to sense an unexpected effect. The town's collective response reinforced his understanding of the hidden currents. Emotional alignment, he realized, was the ultimate leverage. Physical dominance could coerce. Perception could guide. But emotion, aligned subtly, ethically, or strategically, could orchestrate outcomes across networks of minds, producing obedience and cohesion without ever raising a hand. This was the apex of influence, the hidden mastery that civilizations, secret orders, and elite systems had employed for centuries. By midnight, the town's very thought patterns had begun to synchronize around invisible boundaries of expectation, fear, and instinctive obedience. Big Jakab recognized the terrifying potential. A single individual, aligned with hidden currents, could shape perception, behavior, and even thought across an entire population. And now, listening, you must understand, the same principles operate in your world. Unseen forces guide perception, manipulate emotion, and enforce obedience constantly. To awaken is to perceive these currents, and to gain power over them is to inherit a responsibility few can withstand.